Liang production at Fei Gu Literature, the murder. I was called in at 8 o'clock in the morning on Friday, September 17th. I was called in at 8 o'clock in the morning on Friday, September 17th. There is nothing that can be done. She had been dead for several hours. That it was just after 9 o'clock when I arrived home again. I opened the front door with my key, deliberately stalling in the hall for a few minutes. Hanging up my hat and what I consider to be a sensible protection against the chill of an early fall morning, is the light jacket. To be honest, hanging up my hat and what I consider to be a sensible protection against the chill of an early fall morning, is the light jacket. To be honest, I felt quite uneasy and worried. I won't pretend at that moment that I foresaw the events of the following weeks. I definitely didn't do that. But my intuition tells me. There are turbulent times ahead. From the dining room to my left came the clinking of teacups and the short, dry cough of my sister Caroline. "Is that you, James?" she cried. An unnecessary question, because who else? To be honest. It was my sister, Caroline, who delayed me for a few minutes. As Mr. Kipling said, the mongoose family motto is, to find out the truth. If Caroline were to adopt a coat of arms, would definitely suggest the image of a mongoose. The first part of the motto can be omitted. Caroline could find out a lot of information just by sitting quietly at home. I don't know how she does it, but it is what it is. I suspect the servants and merchants formed her intelligence apparatus. When she goes out, it's not to gather information, but to spread the message. She's also very good at this. It's this last quality of hers that gives me pause. Whatever I said to Caroline now about Mrs. Ferrar's death would be known throughout the village in an hour and a half. As a professional, I naturally pursue caution. Therefore, I made a habit of constantly hiding all possible information from my sister. She usually still finds out, but I have the moral satisfaction of knowing that I'm not at fault in any way. Mrs. Ferrar's husband died more than a year ago, Caroline continued to claim. There was an unfounded belief that his wife had poisoned him. She scornfully dismissed my invariable answer that Mr. Ferrars had died of acute gastritis, a condition brought about by habitual excessive drinking. I agree. The symptoms of gastritis and arsenic poisoning do appear to be somewhat similar, but Caroline's accusations were based on completely different grounds. "You just have to look at her," I heard her say. Mrs. Ferrard, although no longer young, was still a very attractive woman, and her clothes, however simple, were. But even so, many women buy clothes in Paris, which does not necessarily poison their husbands. As I hesitated in the hall, these thoughts running through my mind, Caroline's voice came again, with a hint of edge in her tone. "What the hell are you doing out there, James? Why don't you come in for breakfast?" "I just got here, dear," I said hurriedly. "I'm hanging up my coat." "You can hang up 6 coats during this period." She was right. I could have. I walked into the restaurant and gave Caroline a customary kiss on the cheek. then sat down to eat eggs and bacon. The bacon was a bit cold. You got the call this morning, Caroline said. Yes, I said. The King's Meadow. Mrs. Ferrars then sat down to eat eggs and bacon. The bacon was a bit cold. You got the call this morning, Caroline said. Yes. But he is a talkative person. There was a... I know, my sister said again. This time I was troubled. You can't know, I snapped. I didn't know it myself until I know, my sister said again. This time I was troubled. You can't know, I snapped. I didn't know it myself until I got there, and I didn't tell anyone. If that girl Annie knew. He learned about it from the Ferrars cook. He learned. Sarcasm was wasted on Caroline. She takes it seriously and answers accordingly. He didn't know, she explained. After all, Caroline was bound to hear it sooner or later. She might as well hear it directly from me. She died from an overdose of phenobarbital. She had been taking it recently to treat insomnia. Must have taken too much. Nonsense, Caroline said immediately. She did it on purpose. Don't tell me. It's strange how, must have taken too much. Nonsense, Caroline said immediately. She did it on purpose. Don't tell me. It's strange how, when you have a secret belief that you don't want to admit, the mention of it causes you to angrily deny it. I immediately spoke angrily. There you go again, I said. There's no reason to rush. Why did Mrs. Ferrars commit suicide? A relatively young widow, financially well off, in good health, with nothing to do but enjoy life. This is ridiculous. Not at all. Even you must have noticed how different she looks lately. She looked really exhausted. And you just admitted that she hasn't been able to sleep. What is your diagnosis? I asked coldly. An unfortunate love affair, I suppose? My sister shook her head. Remorse, she said cheerfully. Remorse? Yes. You never believed me when I said she poisoned her husband. Now I am even more convinced of this. I don't think you're being very logical, I objected. If a woman committed a crime, there may be such women, but Mrs. Ferrars is not one of them. She was nervous. A strong impulse drives her to get rid of her husband, because she is the kind of person who simply cannot bear any. There may be such women, but Mrs. Ferrars is not one of them. She was nervous. A strong impulse drives her to get rid of her husband, because she is the kind of person who simply cannot bear any pain, no doubt about it. The wife of a man like Ashley Ferrars must have been through a lot of pain. I nodded. She has been haunted by what she did ever since. I couldn't help but feel sorry for her. The wife of a man like Ashley Ferrars must have been through a lot of pain. I nodded. She has been haunted by what she did ever since. I couldn't help but feel sorry for her. I don't think Caroline ever felt sorry for Mrs. Ferrars while she was alive. Now that she has traveled to a place where she can, presumably, no longer wear Parisian fashions, Caroline prepares to bask in the softer emotions of sympathy and understanding. That I told her firmly. Her whole idea was bullshit. I was even more determined because I secretly agreed with at least some of what she said. But Caroline was completely wrong to arrive at the truth through a mere inspired guess. I don't intend to encourage this kind of thing. Her whole idea was bullshit. I was even more determined because I secretly agreed with at least some of what she said. But Caroline was completely wrong to arrive at the truth through a mere inspired guess. I don't intend to encourage this kind of thing. She would go around the village expressing her opinion, and everyone would assume it was based on the medical data I provided. Life is really annoying. Bullshit, Caroline said in response to my criticism. You wait and see. 9 times out of 10 she left a letter admitting everything. She left no letter of any kind, I said sharply, not seeing where this admission would lead me. Oh, said Caroline. So you did ask about that, huh? I'm sure, James, deep down inside you think very much like me. You are a precious old liar. One always has to consider the possibility of suicide, I said repressedly. Will there be an inquest? There may be. It all depends. If I could be absolutely certain that the overdose was accidental, an autopsy might not be necessary. Are you really satisfied? My sister asked tactfully. I didn't answer, but stood up from the table. Chapter 2. King Abbott's Who's Who. Before I go on to tell what I said to Caroline and what Caroline said to me, it may be necessary to give some idea of our local geography. Our village, King's Abbott. Very similar to other villages, I guess. Our large town is Cranchester, 9 miles away. We had a large train station, a small post office, and 2 competing general stores. Men of working age tend to leave this place at a young age. But we are very well off in terms of single ladies and retired military officers. Our hobbies and entertainment can be summed up in one word, that is, gossip. In the village of King's Abbott there are only 2 important houses. One, King's Meadow, was left to Mrs. Farrar's late husband. The other is Fairley Park, owned by Roger Ackroyd. Ackroyd always interested me because he was a man who was more of a country squire than any country squire. He's reminiscent of those red-faced jocks who always showed up early in the first act of old-school musical comedies. The background is a village green. They usually sing a song about going to London. Nowadays we have variety shows and Squire has disappeared in musical fashion. Of course, Ackroyd was not really a country squire. He was an extremely successful, I think, wagon wheel maker. He is almost 50 years old. He has a ruddy complexion and a kind temperament. He had a close relationship with the parish priest, contributed generously to parish funds, although he was rumored to be stingy with personal expenses, and supported cricket matches, junior clubs and the Disabled Soldiers Association. In fact, he is the soul and vitality of our peaceful village of King Abbott. When Roger Ackroyd was 21, he fell in love with and married a beautiful woman 5 or 6 years his senior. Her name was Parton, and she was a widow with 1 child. The history of this marriage was short and painful. Mrs. Ackroyd is, to put it bluntly, an alcoholic. She drank heavily during the 4 years of her marriage and ended up walking to her grave. In the following years, Ackroyd showed no intention of remarrying. His wife's child from a previous marriage was 7 years old when their mother died. Now he is 25 years old. Ackroyd had always regarded him as his own son and raised him accordingly, but he had always been a naughty child, causing constant worry and trouble for his stepfather. Nonetheless, we here at King Abbott absolutely love Ralph Payton. First of all, he is a very handsome young man. As I said before, people in our village are very fond of gossip. It was noticed from the outset that Ackroyd and Mrs. Ferrars got along well. This closeness became even more evident after her husband's death. They always appear in public together. It was widely speculated that after her period of mourning was over, Mrs. Ferrars would become the wife of Roger Ackroyd. In fact, people think there is some legitimacy to this. Roger Ackroyd's wife apparently died of alcoholism. Ashley Ferrars had been an alcoholic for many years before her death. The 2 victims of alcoholism clung to each other as if they were making amends. Ashley Ferrars had been an alcoholic for many years, but there was already a circle of gossip surrounding Ackroyd. Throughout Ralph Payton's growth into adulthood, a series of housekeepers presided over Ackroyd's household, each of whom was viewed with suspicion by Caroline and her friends. It is no exaggeration to say that at least 15 years. The whole village confidently expected Ackroyd to marry one of the housekeepers. The last housekeeper, a formidable lady named Miss Russell, had reigned undisputed for 5 years, twice as long as her predecessors. People think. Had it not been for Mrs. Ferrars' arrival, Ackroyd's escape would have been almost impossible. There is another factor, the unexpected arrival of the widowed sister-in-law and her daughter from Canada. Lady Cecil Ackroyd, the widow of Ackroyd's idle brother, had settled in Fernley Park. And, according to Caroline, succeeded in placing Miss Russell in her rightful place. I don't know exactly what the right place looks like. It sounds cold and unpleasant, but I do know that Miss Russell always has her lips pursed and a smile on her face that I can only describe as a sour smile. And she expressed great sympathy for poor Mrs. Ackroyd, dependent on the alms of her husband's brother. Alms bread is so bitter, isn't it? If I didn't work for a living, I would definitely be miserable. I wonder what Lady Cecil Ackroyd thought of the Ferrars affair. When the subject came up, it was clearly to Ackroyd's advantage that she remained single. Whenever she met Mrs. Ferrars, she was always charming, not to say overly enthusiastic. Caroline said it proved almost nothing. We at King's Abbott have been concerned with these issues over the years. We discussed Ackroyd and his affairs from various angles. Mrs. Ferrars had settled into her place in the scheme. Now the kaleidoscope is rearranged. From a mild discussion of possible wedding gifts, we are jerked into the heart of the tragedy. With these and various other things going over and over in my mind, I continued my patrol mechanically. I have no particular case that interests me. That's probably a good thing, because my thoughts returned again and again to the mystery of Mrs. Farrar's death. Did she commit suicide? If she did, surely she would have left something to say about her thoughts. In my experience, women commit suicide once they make up their mind. It is often desirable to reveal the psychological state that led to this fatal act. They crave the spotlight. When was the last time I saw her? It's been over a week. She was acting pretty normal, considering everything. Then I suddenly remembered that I saw her yesterday. Didn't talk to her though. I was surprised that she went with Ralph Payton because I had no idea he might be in Kim Abbott. I do think he and his stepfather eventually fell out. I haven't seen him here in nearly 6 months. They walked side by side, heads close to each other. She was talking very seriously. That I think I can safely say that it was at this moment that premonitions of the future first came to me. Nothing concrete yet, but a vague hunch of where things are headed. The earnest tête-à-tête between Ralph Payton and Mrs. Farrars the day before had displeased me. While I was still thinking about this, I happened to come face to face with Roger Ackroyd. "Shepherd," he exclaimed. "Exactly who I wanted to connect with. This is a terrible thing. Have you heard of it?" He nodded. I could see that he was deeply affected. His big rosy cheeks seemed to be sunken, and he didn't look as happy and healthy as he usually was. "It's worse than you think." "It's worse," he whispered. "Listen, Shepherd. I have to talk to you. Can you go back with me now?" "Hardly. I have 3 more patients to see and I have to go back to see my surgical patients before 12 o'clock. Then this afternoon, no, let's have dinner tonight. Is 7:30 okay? Is this appropriate?" "Yeah, I can handle this." "What's wrong? Is it Ralph?" I hardly know why I say that, except, perhaps, that it is so often Ralph. Ackroyd stared at me blankly, seeming to hardly understand. I began to realize that a certain something is definitely wrong somewhere. I have never seen Ackroyd so disturbed. "Ralph," he said vaguely. "Oh. No, it's Ralph. Ralph's in London, damn. Here comes old Miss Gannett. I don't want to talk to her about this terrible thing. See you tonight, Shepherd. 7:30. I nodded and he hurried away, leaving me thinking. Ralph in London? But he was indeed at King's Abbot yesterday afternoon. He must have been back in town last night or this morning, yet Ackroyd's attitude conveyed an entirely different impression. He spoke as if Ralph had not been near this place for months. I didn't have time to think about this further. Miss Gannett was before me, eager for information. Miss Gannett had all the characteristics of my sister Caroline, but she lacked that accuracy in reaching conclusions that made Caroline's actions appear great. Miss Gannett was breathless and full of inquiries. Poor Mrs. Ferrars is so miserable, isn't she? A lot of people were saying she had been a drug addict for years. It's so nasty the way people talk. However, the worst part is, there is usually a grain of truth in these wild claims. No fire, no smoke. They also said Mr. Ackroyd had found out about the affair and had broken off the engagement, because there had been an engagement. She, Miss Gannett, had solid evidence. Of course I have to know everything. Doctors always know, but they never tell. And all this while she watched my piercing gaze over my reaction to the suggestions. Fortunately, my long relationship with Caroline allowed me to keep a straight face and have some non-committal comments at the ready. On this occasion, I congratulate Miss Gannett for not engaging in malicious gossip. I think this is a pretty clever counterattack. It threw her into a corner, and before she could adjust, I was gone. I went home to meditate and found several patients waiting for me in the operating room. I thought I had seen off my last patient and was about to spend a few minutes in the garden before lunch, when I noticed another patient waiting for me. She stood up and walked towards me. I was a little surprised. I don't know why I am like this. Except there was something cast iron about Miss Russell, something beyond physical pain. Ackroyd's housekeeper is a tall woman, handsome but formidable. With her stern eyes and tight lips, I felt as if I were a maid or kitchen maid. He will run away as fast as he can when he hears her approach. "Good morning, Dr. Shepherd," said Miss Russell. "I would really appreciate it if you could take a look at my knee." I watched it, but to be honest, I didn't understand any better when I finished it. Miss Russell's description of the vague pain is so unconvincing that a woman of less integrity would have suspected it of being a fabricated story. It did occur to me for a moment that Miss Russell might have made up the knee ailment on purpose. In order to inquire about Mrs. Ferrars' death from me, but I soon realized that, on this point, I had at least misunderstood her. She mentioned the tragedy briefly, but that was it. However, she definitely seemed willing to stop and chat. "Well, thank you very much for the potion, doctor," she said at last. "But I don't believe it will have any effect." I didn't expect this either, but I protested out of a sense of responsibility. After all, it can't hurt, and one has to defend his tools. "I don't believe in these drugs," said Miss Sayer, looking disdainfully at my row of bottles. "Drugs cause a lot of harm. Look at cocaine addiction. So, about that it's very common among the upper classes." I believe Miss Russell knows far more about the upper classes than I do. I made no attempt to argue with her. "Just tell me this, doctor," said Miss Russell. "Let's say you actually become a slave to your drug habit. Is there any treatment?" One cannot answer such a question casually. I briefly explained the subject to her, and she listened attentively. I still suspected that she was asking for information about Mrs. Ferrars. Now, for example, phenobarbital, I continued. But strangely, she didn't seem interested in veronal. Instead, she changed the subject and asked me if there were really certain poisons that were so rare that they couldn't detection. Ah. I said. You're reading a detective story. She admitted she had. The essence of a detective story, I said. It was a rare poison, if possible, from South America that no one had ever heard of, something used by some unknown savage tribe to poison their arrows. Death is instantaneous and Western science can do nothing about it. Is this what you're referring to? Yes. Is there really such a thing? I shook my head regretfully. I'm afraid not. There's curare here, of course. I told her a lot about curare, but she seemed to lose interest again. She asked me if I had curare in my poison cabinet, when I said no. I feel like my evaluation in her mind has gone down. She said she had to go back and I saw her walking out the operating room door just as the lunch bell rang. That I should never doubt Miss Russell's fondness for detective stories. Imagine her walking out of the housekeeper's room to scold a maid for failing in her duties. And then it makes me so happy to get back to the comfort of my surroundings and read The Mystery of the Seventh Death, or something like that. Chapter 3. The Man Who Grows Pumpkins. That I told Caroline I should eat at Fernley for lunch. She did not object, on the contrary. Very good, she said. You'll hear everything. By the way, what happened to Ralph? With Ralph? I said in surprise, not any. Then why was he staying at the Three Boars Hotel and not at Fernley Park? I did not doubt Caroline's statement that Ralph Peyton was staying at a local hotel. Caroline saying that was enough for me. Ackroyd told me he was in London, I said. In that moment of surprise, I deviated from my cherished rule of never divulging information. Oh, said Caroline. I could see her nose twitching at this point. He arrived yesterday morning with 3 pigs, she said. He's still there. He was with a girl last night. This doesn't surprise me at all. Ralph, I should say, was with the girls almost every night. But I do feel a little strange. He chose to enjoy this pastime in King's Abbot rather than in that bustling metropolis. Is it one of the barmaids? I asked. No. That's it. He went out to meet her. I don't know who she is. It was painful for Caroline to admit such a thing. But I can guess. My tireless sister continued. That I waited patiently. His cousin. Flora Ackroyd? I exclaimed in surprise. Flora Ackroyd is of course not related to Ralph Peyton in any way. But Ralph had been considered Ackroyd's biological son for so long that the cousin relationship was accepted as a matter of course. Flora Ackroyd, my sister said. But if he wanted to see her, why not go to Fernley? Secret engagement, said Caroline enthusiastically. Old Ackroyd would not agree, and this was the only way they could meet. I found a lot of flaws in Caroline's theory, but I didn't point them out. An innocent remark about our new neighbor caused a red herring. The house next door, Larches, recently rented by a stranger. Caroline was extremely annoyed that she could learn nothing about him except that he was a foreigner. Investigations by the intelligence services were fruitless. Presumably, the man, like the others, should have milk, vegetables, cuts of meat and the occasional white fish. But those responsible for supplying the stuff don't seem to have any information. His name was apparently Poirot, a name that gave off a strange sense of unreality. All we know is that he was interested in growing vegetable squash. But this is obviously not the information Caroline wants. She wanted to know where he was from, what he did, if he was married, what his wife was or was like now, if he had any children, what his mother's maiden name was, and so on. I think people like Caroline must have invented the passport question. "Dear Caroline," I said. There was no doubt about the man's profession. He is a retired barber. Look at his beard. Caroline disagreed. She said that if the man was a hairstylist, he should have wavy hair, not straight hair. All hairstylists are like this. I mentioned a few hairstylists I personally knew with straight hair, but Caroline refused to believe it. "I can't understand him at all," she said in an aggrieved tone. "I borrowed some gardening tools the other day and he was very polite, but I couldn't ask anything." Finally, I asked him point blank if he was French and he said no. I don't know why and didn't want to ask him again. I began to be more interested in our mysterious neighbor. A man who could shut up Caroline and leave her empty-handed like the Queen of Sheba must be someone with personality. "I believe," said Caroline, "that new vacuum cleaner he bought dash." I saw the meditative loan in her eyes and the opportunity for further questions. I took the chance and escaped into the garden. I was gardening interesting while I was busy uprooting dandelions. A warning shout came from nearby. Then a heavy object flew past my ear and landed at my feet, making a disgusting gurgling sound. "That's a vegetable squash." I looked up angrily. Beyond the wall, a face appeared on the left. An egg-shaped head, partially covered by suspiciously black hair, and two huge beards. There is also a pair of vigilant eyes. "That's our mysterious neighbor, Mr. Poirot." He apologized immediately and fluently. "I beg your forgiveness 1,000 times, sir. I have no defense. I have been cultivating these marrows for months. This morning I suddenly felt angry about these marrows. I let them go for a walk, alas. Not just mentally, but physically. I grabbed the biggest one and threw it over the wall. Sir, I am ashamed. I kneel to you." My anger had to melt in the face of such frequent apologies. After all, the poor vegetable didn't hit me. But I really hope that throwing giant vegetables over the wall isn't our new friend's hobby. Such habits hardly make him a good neighbor in our minds. That strange little man seems to be able to read my thoughts. Ah! No, he exclaimed. Don't let yourself get upset. It's not a habit for me. But can you imagine, sir, that a man might work hard for some object, toil for some leisure and occupation, and then find that ultimately what he longs for is the busy days of the past, and what he thought he was glad to leave behind? Old career? Yes, I said slowly. I think this is a fairly common phenomenon. I myself may be an example. A year ago I inherited an inheritance, enough to fulfill a dream. I've always wanted to travel and see the world. Well, like I said, that was a year ago, and I'm still here. My little neighbor nodded. Yokes of habit. We strive to achieve a goal, and when the goal is achieved, we find that what is missing is the daily toil. Please note, sir, my job is interesting work. The most interesting job in the world. Really? I said encouragingly. Now. Caroline's spirit is strong in my heart. A study of human nature, sir. That's it, I said kindly. Apparently a retired barber. Who knows the secrets of human nature better than the barber? Besides, I have a friend who has never left my side in all these years. His stupidity was occasionally scary, but he was very precious to me. Imagine even missing his silliness. His innocence, his honest perspective, and the joy of delighting and surprising him through my superior talents. That's something I'll miss more than I can tell you. Is he dead? I asked sympathetically. That's not the case. He lives and thrives, but on the other side of the world. He is now in Argentina. In Argentina, I said enviously. I've always wanted to go to South America. I sighed, and then looked up to find Mr. Porritt looking at me sympathetically. He seemed like an understanding little man. You're going there, aren't you? He asked. I sighed and shook my head. I could have gone, I said, a year ago. But I was stupid, even worse than stupid, greedy. I risked losing substance by chasing a shadow. I see, said Mr. Poirot. Are you speculating? I nodded sadly, but despite this, I felt secretly entertained in my heart. This ridiculous little man looked so solemn. Isn't it the porcupine oil field? He asked suddenly. I stared. Actually, I thought about them. But in the end I settled on a gold mine in Western Australia. My neighbor looked at me with a strange expression that I could not understand. It is fate, he said at last. What is fate? I asked impatiently. I was actually going to live with a guy who was seriously considering the porcupine oil field and the Western Australian goldfields. Tell me, do you like auburn hair too? I stared at him dumbfounded, and he burst out laughing. No, I'm not suffering from madness. Please feel free to worry. The question I just asked you was silly, because, you see, the friend I'm talking about is a young man who thinks all women are good and most are beautiful. But you are a middle-aged man, a doctor, who knows the folly and vanity of most things in our lives. Okay. We are neighbors. I kindly ask you to accept and convey my sincerest regards to your wonderful sister. He stooped and, with a flourish, produced a huge specimen, which I gladly accepted in the spirit of what he had to offer. Indeed, said the little man cheerfully, this morning was not wasted. I met someone who was similar in some ways to my distant friend. Let me ask you a question by the way. You must know everyone in this small village. Who is that young man with very dark hair and eyes and a handsome face? He held his head high when he walked. A relaxed smile on your lips? This description left me without a doubt. That must be Captain Ralph Patten, I said slowly. Have I not seen him here before? No, he hasn't been here for a while. But he is the son of Mr. Ackroyd of Fernley Park. Rather, an adopted son. My neighbor showed slight impatience. Of course, I should have guessed. Mr. Ackroyd mentioned him several times. Do you know Mr. Ackroyd? I said, slightly surprised. Mr. Ackroyd knew me in London. I was working there at the time. I have asked him not to mention my profession here. I see, I said, feeling quite amused by this obvious snobbery. But the little man moved on with an almost exaggerated smile. A person is more. Prefer to remain anonymous. I don't aspire to fame. I didn't even bother correcting the local version of my name. Indeed, I said, not knowing what to say, Captain Ralph Patten, mused Mr. Poirot. So he was married to Mr. Ackroyd's niece, charming Miss Flora is engaged. Who told you this? I asked. Very surprised. Mr. Ackroyd. About a week ago. He was very happy about it. He had always wanted something like this to happen, or that's what I understood from him. I even believe he put some pressure on the young man. This is absolutely unwise. Young people should marry for their own happiness, not to please a stepfather who has expectations. My thoughts were completely turned upside down. I couldn't imagine Ackroyd confiding in a barber and discussing with him the marriage of his niece and stepson. Ackroyd displayed an affable patronage of the lower classes, but he had a strong sense of his own dignity. I began to think that there was no way Poirot could be a barber. To hide my confusion, I said the first thing that came to mind. What drew you to Ralph Patten? His appearance? No, it's just this, although he's unusually handsome for an Englishman, that your novelist would call a Greek god. No, there's something I don't understand about that young man. When he said the last words, the tone was thoughtful and made an indescribable impression on me. It was as if he were summing up the boy through some inner knowledge I didn't share. It was this impression that stayed with me, for at that moment my sister's voice called me from inside the house. That I went in. Caroline is wearing a hat. Apparently just returned from the village. She started without any foreshadowing. I met Mr. Ackroyd. Really? I said. Of course I stopped him, but he seemed anxious and wanted to leave. That I have no doubt that this is the case. His feelings for Caroline were very similar to what he had felt for Miss Gannett earlier that day, maybe even stronger. Caroline was harder to shake off. I asked him immediately about Ralph. He was in shock, completely unaware that the boy was here. He actually said he thought I must be mistaken. What a mistake. That's ridiculous, I said. He should know you better. Then he told me that Ralph and Flora were engaged. I know that too, I interrupted, with modest pride. Who told you? Our new neighbor. Caroline visibly hesitated for a second or two, like a roulette ball playfully wandering between two numbers. Then she rejected that tempting red herring. I told Mr. Ackroyd that Ralph was staying at the Three Boars. Caroline, I said, don't you ever think about it? Could your habit of repeating everything indiscriminately be causing great harm? Nonsense, my sister said. People should know things. I thought it was my responsibility to tell them. Mr. Ackroyd was very grateful to me. So? I said, because obviously there's more to say. I think he went straight to the Three Pigs, but if that's the case, he didn't find Ralph there. No. Because when I came back through the woods. Coming back from the woods? I interrupted. Caroline blushed gracefully. Today is such a beautiful day, she exclaimed. I think I'll take a spin. The woods are so perfect this season with their fall colors. Caroline cared nothing for the forest in any season. Normally she saw the forest as a wet-footed place where all sorts of unpleasant things might fall. No, this was a good, reliable mongoose instincts lead her to our local woods. This is the only place close to the village of King Abbott where you can talk to young women without being seen by the entire village. It is adjacent to Fernley Park. Okay, I said, go on. As I said, I had just come back from the woods when I heard a noise. Caroline paused. Really? One was Ralph Patton's. I recognized it at once. The other one belongs to a girl. Of course I didn't mean to eavesdrop. Of course not, I interjected, with obvious sarcasm, but it was all in vain for Caroline. But I just couldn't help hearing it. The girl said something. I didn't catch it, and Ralph answered. He sounded very angry. Dear girl, he said. Don't you realize that the old man would probably strip me down to a shilling? He has become quite tired of me over the past few years. A little more would be enough. And we need money, honey. When the old man dies, I will be a very rich man. He was a miser, but he actually had a lot of money. I don't want him to change his will. Don't worry. Leave it to me and don't worry. Those were his exact words. I remember it very clearly. Unfortunately, That's when I stepped on a dry branch or something and they just lowered their voices and walked away. Of course I couldn't catch up with them, so I didn't get to see who the girl was. That must be very annoying, I said. But I suppose you hurried to the Three Pigs, felt dizzy, went into the bar for a glass of brandy, and were therefore able to see both waitresses at work? That's not a barmaid, Caroline said without hesitation. In fact, I'm almost certain it was Flora Ackroyd. It's just that dash. It just doesn't seem to make sense, I agreed. But if it wasn't Flora, who could it be? Quickly, my sister made a list of the girls who lived nearby and gave numerous reasons for and against. When she paused to catch her breath, I whispered a word about a patient and slipped out. That I proposed heading to the Three Boars pub. It looks like Ralph Payton should be back there by now. That I knew Ralph very well, perhaps better than anyone at King Abbott. Because I had known his mother before him, I understood a lot of things about him that confused others. He was somewhat a victim of heredity. He didn't inherit his mother's fatal alcoholism, but he did have a touch of vulnerability about him. As my new friend I met this morning said, he is incredibly handsome. Standing nearly 6 feet tall and perfectly built with an athletic grace, he was darker-skinned like his mother and had a handsome, tanned face, always ready to smile. Ralph Patton is one of those people who is naturally charming and effortlessly charming. He is self-indulgent, extravagant and has no respect for anything in the world, but he is still lovable and his friends are loyal to him. Is there anything I can do to that boy? I thought I could. Inquiring at the Three Pigs bar, I discovered that Captain Patton had just come in. I went upstairs to his room and entered unannounced. For a moment, thinking back on what I had heard and seen, I was doubtful of my reception, but I need not have had any apprehensions. Oops, it's Shepard. Nice to meet you. He stepped forward to greet me, holding out his hand, a sunny smile lighting up his face. I'm so happy for the man I met in this terrible place. That I raised my eyebrows. What is this place doing? He let out an exasperated laugh. It's a long story. Doctor. I haven't been having a good time lately. But come and have a drink. Thank you, I said, I will. He rang the bell, then came back and sank down in his chair. I don't want to mince words, he said grimly, I'm in big trouble. In fact, I had no idea what to do next. What's wrong? I asked sympathetically. This is my fucking stepfather. What did he do? It's not what he has done, but what he might do. The bell rang, and Ralph ordered a drink. After the man left, he huddled in his armchair, frowning and talking to himself. Is this really serious? I asked. He nodded. It's really hard for me this time, he said seriously. The unusual gravity in his voice told me he was telling the truth. It was not easy to make Ralph serious. The truth is, he continued, I can't see the road ahead. I'm really helpless. If I can help. I suggested cautiously. But he shook his head very firmly. That's very kind of you, Doctor. But I can't let you get involved in this. I have to do it alone. He was silent for a minute, then repeated in a slightly different tone. Yes, I must act alone. Chapter 4. Dinner at Fernley. It was a few minutes before 7:30 when I rang the front doorbell at Fernley Park. The door was opened with admirable promptness by butler Parker. The night is so beautiful that I would rather walk here. I walked into the spacious hall. Parker helped me take off my coat. Just then, Ackroyd's secretary, a young man named Raymond, passed the hall with his hands full of documents and was on his way to Ackroyd's study. Good evening, Doctor. Come for supper? Or is this a professional visit? The last sentence refers to the black bag I placed on the oak trunk. Did I explain that I could receive a subpoena on the detention case at any time, so I came out prepared for emergencies. Raymond nodded, continued on his way, and turned around and said, Go to the living room. You know the way. Ladies will be down in a moment. I have to take these papers to Mr. Ackroyd and I'll tell him you're here. Parker had already backed out when Raymond showed up, so I was alone in the hall. I straightened my tie and glanced at the large mirror hanging there. Then I walked towards the door facing me, which I knew was the door to the living room. Did I notice that just as I turned the handle, there was a sound coming from inside? I thought it was the sound of a window closing. I may say that I noticed this rather mechanically and did not attach any importance to it at the time. I opened the door and walked in. At this moment, I almost bumped into Miss Russell, who had just come out. We all apologized. For the first time I found myself looking at the housekeeper, thinking what a beautiful woman she had been. Indeed, for that matter, she still was. Her dark hair was not streaked with gray, and when there was color on her face, as it was now, her stern appearance was less obvious. That I subconsciously wondered if she had been out, because her breathing was rapid, as if she had just run. I'm afraid I'm a few minutes early, I said. Oh. I don't think so. It's 7:30 now, Dr. Shepherd. She paused for a minute before saying, Didn't know you were invited to dinner tonight. Mr. Ackroyd made no mention of this incident. I had a vague feeling that she was a little unhappy that I was dining there, but I couldn't imagine why. How's the knee? I asked. Pretty much, thank you, Doctor. I have to go now. Mrs. Ackroyd will be down shortly. I just came in to see if the flowers were okay. She quickly walked out of the room. I wandered over to the window and wondered what she was clearly trying to do to justify her presence in the room. When I did, I saw something that I would have known, if I had cared to think about it, which was that the windows were long French windows that opened onto the terrace. Therefore, the sound I heard could not have been the sound of the window closing. That I did nothing more to distract myself from painful thoughts. For no other reason than I tried to guess what was causing that sound. Coals on the fire? No, it's not that sound at all. Drawer pushed in. It's not like that either. Then my eye was caught by what I believe was called a silver table, with a lid that could be opened. The contents can be seen through the glass. I walked over and studied the things carefully. There were 1 or 2 pieces of old silver, a baby shoe belonging to Charles I, some Chinese jade carvings, and a considerable number of African tools and curiosities. Wanting to examine one of the jade carvings more closely, I lifted the lid. It slipped from my hand and fell. That I immediately recognized the voice I heard. It was the sound of the table cover being gently and carefully closed. I repeated this action once or twice for my own satisfaction. Then I lifted the lid and examined the contents more closely. I was still bending over the open silver table when Flora Ackroyd entered the room. Many people dislike Flora Ackroyd, but no one can help but admire her. To her friends, she was extremely charming. The first thing that strikes you is her extraordinary complexion. She has true Scandinavian blonde hair. Her eyes were blue as the waters of the Norwegian fjords, and her skin was cream and rose. She had square boyish shoulders and slim hips. For a jaded doctor. It is very refreshing to encounter such perfect health. A simple and straightforward British girl. I may be a bit old-fashioned, but I think the real thing is hard to beat. Flora joins me at the silver table. Expressing heretical doubts as to whether King Charles I ever wore baby shoes. And, continued Miss Flora, to make such a fuss because anyone wears or uses these things seems to me just nonsense. Now they don't wear or use them. The pen that George Eliot wrote, "The Mill on the Floss," this thing, well, it was just a pen after all. If you really like George Eliot, why not pick up a cheap copy of Mill on the Floss and read it? I suppose you've never read anything so old and outdated, Miss Flora? You're wrong, Dr. Shepherd. I love Mill on the Floss. I'm pretty happy to hear that. What young women are reading now and claiming to like stuff scares me so much. You haven't congratulated me yet, Dr. Shepherd, said Flora. Didn't you hear? She held out her left hand. On the third finger was a fine solitaire pearl. I intend to marry Ralph, you know, she continued. Uncle is very pleased. That keeps me in the family, you know. I held her hands. My dear, I said, I hope you will be very happy. We have been engaged for about a month, Flora continued in a calm voice, but the announcement was only made yesterday. My uncle is going to repair the cross stone and give it to us to live in, and we plan to pretend to farm. Actually, we would go hunting all winter, go to town in the spring, and go yachting. I love the sea. Of course, I would be very interested in parish affairs and attend all the mothers' meetings. Just then, Mrs. Ackroyd hurried in, apologizing profusely for being late. I'm sorry to say. I hate Mrs. Ackroyd. She was covered in chains, teeth, and bones. A very unpleasant woman. She had small, pale, hard blue eyes that were coldly full of speculation, no matter how passionate her words. That I walked up to her. Leave Flora by the window. She gave me a handful of assorted knuckles and rings to squeeze and started talking non-stop. Have I heard of Flora's engagement? Such a fit in every way. It was love at first sight for the lovely young couple. Such a perfect couple, and he's so dark. She is so white. I can't tell you, dear Dr. Shepherd, what a relief this is to a mother's heart. Mrs. Ackroyd sighed, a tribute to her mother's soul, while her eyes watched me keenly. I was thinking. You are an old friend of dear Roger. We know how much he trusts your judgment. It was difficult for me, as poor Cecil's widow. But there's a lot of annoying stuff, you know, all of it. I have every confidence that Roger intended to make arrangements for dear Flora, but as you know, he was a little weird about money. I've heard that this is common among leaders in industry. I was wondering if you could test his thinking. Flora likes you very much. We feel like you're an old friend, even though we've only really known you for 2 years. Mrs. Ackroyd's eloquence was interrupted by the drawing-room door opening again. I was delighted with the interruption. I hate meddling in other people's affairs, and I had no intention of dealing with Ackroyd over Flora's estate. After a while, I had to tell Mrs. Ackroyd that. You know Major Blunt, right, Doctor? Yes, indeed, I said. Many people know Hector Blunt, or at least have heard of him. He has hunted more wildlife in unlikely places than any living man. I think when you mention him, people say, Blunt, you don't mean the big hunter, do you? That his friendship with Ackroyd has always been a bit confusing to me. These two people are completely different. Hector Blunt was about 5 years younger than Ackroyd. They became friends when they were young. Although their lifestyles have diverged, the friendship remains. Every 2 years or so, Blunt would spend 2 weeks at Fernley, and a giant animal head, complete with an astonishing number of horns, would stare blankly at you as you walked in the front door. Became a permanent reminder of friendship. Brown now enters the room with his own unique, deliberate yet light stride. He is a man of medium height, stocky and slightly stocky. His face was almost reddish-brown, and his expression was unusually bland. He has a pair of gray eyes, giving the impression of always watching what is happening in the distance. He didn't talk much, and what he said was stiff, as if he had squeezed it out unwillingly. He said, "How are you, Shepherd?" in his usual curt way, and stood facing the fireplace, looking over our heads. It's like watching something very interesting happening in Timbuktu. Major Blunt, said Flora, I wish you could tell me these African things. I am sure you know what they are, that I have heard Hector Blunt described as a misogynist. But I noticed that he joined Flora at the silver table with what might be called enthusiasm. They leaned over the table together. That I was worried that Mrs. Ackroyd would talk about reconciliation again, so I made a hasty mention of the new sweet pea. I know there is a new sweet pea. Because the Daily Mail told me that morning. Mrs. Ackroyd knew nothing about gardening, but she was the kind of woman who liked to appear well-informed on today's topics, and she read the Daily Mail. Until Ackroyd and his secretary joined us. We were able to have a pretty intelligent conversation, and then Parker announced the start of dinner. My place at the table was between Mrs. Ackroyd and Flora. Blunt sat on the other side of Mrs. Ackroyd, and Geoffrey Raymond sat next to him. Dinner was not pleasant. Ackroyd looked preoccupied. He looked in pain and had barely eaten. Mrs. Ackroyd, Raymond, and I kept up the conversation. Flora seems to be affected by her uncle's depression, while Blunt returns to his usual taciturnity. After dinner, Ackroyd immediately took my arm and led me to his study. After we finish our coffee, we won't be disturbed again, he explained. I told Raymond to make sure we didn't get interrupted. I watched him quietly, but he didn't seem to do this. He was evidently affected by some intense excitement. For a minute or two he walked up and down the room, and then sat sluggishly in the armchair before the fire when Parker came in with a tray of coffee. This study room is a comfortable apartment. One wall is lined with bookshelves. The chair is huge. Covered in dark blue leather. There is a large table by the window with documents and information neatly stacked on it. Various magazines and sports newspapers were placed on the round table. I've been feeling that pain again after eating lately, Ackroyd said casually, pouring himself some coffee. You must give me more of your pills. I realized that he was anxious to give the impression that our meeting was a medical one. So I played along accordingly. I thought so. I brought some up. Good man. Hand them over now. They're in the bag in the hallway. I'll get it. Ackroyd arrested me. Don't worry. Parker will get it. Bring the doctor's bag in, okay, Parker? Very good, sir. Parker stepped back. As I was about to speak, Ackroyd raised his hand. Not yet. Wait a minute. Can't you see I'm so nervous that I can barely control myself? I see it clearly. I feel very uneasy. All kinds of premonitions hit me. Ackroyd said it again almost immediately. Can you make sure the window is closed? He asked. Somewhat surprised, I got up and walked towards it. That's not a French window, but a regular sash type. Heavy blue velvet curtains were drawn in front of it, but the top of the window was open. Parker re-entered the room while I was still at the window, taking my bag with him. It's okay, I said, re-entering the room. Have you locked the latch? Yes. What's wrong with you, Ackroyd? The door had just closed behind Parker, otherwise I wouldn't have asked the question. Ackroyd waited a minute before answering. I'm in hell, he said slowly, a minute later. No, never mind those damn pills. I'm just saying that for Parker's sake. The servants are so curious. Come and sit down. The door is closed too, isn't it? Yes. No one can eavesdrop, don't be upset. Shepherd, no one knows what I have been through in the past 24 hours. If a man's house really falls apart around him, mine did. This thing about Ralph was the last straw. But we won't talk about that now. It's another. I don't know what to do with it. And I had to make up my mind quickly. What's the problem? Ackroyd was silent for a minute or two. He seemed strangely disgusted at the beginning. When he spoke, the question he asked took me completely by surprise. This was the last thing I expected. Shepherd, you cared for Ashley Ferrars during his final illness, didn't you? Yes, I did. He seemed to have greater difficulty formulating his next question. You never doubted. Have you ever thought he might have been poisoned? I was silent for a minute or two. Then I made up my mind what I was going to say. Roger Ackroyd was not Caroline. I'll tell you the truth, I said. I had no doubts at all. But since, well, my sister's small talk first gave me the idea. From then on, I couldn't get it out of my head. Note, however, that I have no basis for this suspicion. He was poisoned, said Ackroyd. He spoke in a dull, low voice. Who did it? I asked sharply. His wife. How do you know? She told me herself. When? Yesterday. Oh my God. Yesterday. It feels like 10 years ago. I waited a minute, and then he continued. You know, Shepherd, I'm telling you this out of trust. This matter can no longer be spread. I need your advice. I can't handle all the stress alone. Like I just said, I don't know what to do. Can you tell me the whole story? I said. I'm still confused. How did Mrs. Ferrars confess to you? Here's the thing. I proposed to Mrs. Ferrars 3 months ago. She refused. I asked her again and she agreed, but she refused to let me make the engagement public until her mourning period was over. I called on her yesterday and pointed out that 1 year and 3 weeks had passed since her husband's death, so there was no longer any reason to object to a public engagement. I've noticed that she's been acting very strange these days. Now, suddenly, without warning, she had a complete meltdown. She told me everything. Her hatred of her violent husband, her growing love for me, and the horrific methods she resorted to. Poison. Oh my God. This is cold-blooded murder. I saw the disgust and fear on Ackroyd's face. Mrs. Ferrars must have seen it too. Ackroyd is not the kind of great lover who can forgive everything for the sake of love. He is essentially a good citizen. In that moment of revelation, all his health, everything that was upright and law-abiding must have turned completely toward her. Yes, he continued, his voice low and monotonous, she confessed everything. It seemed that there was someone who knew the truth all along, who had been extorting huge sums of money from her. It was the pressure that almost drove her crazy. Who is that person? Suddenly there appeared before my eyes the image of Ralph Patten and Mrs. Ferrars standing side by side. Their heads were so close. I felt a brief surge of anxiety. Suppose, oh. But this is certainly not possible. I remember Ralph's warm greeting that afternoon. Absurd. She wouldn't tell me his name, Ackroyd said slowly. Actually, she didn't say it was a man. But of course. Of course, I agreed. It must be a man. Don't you have any doubt at all? Ackroyd groaned and buried his head in his hands. This can't be possible, he said. I'm crazy to even think about such a thing. No, I won't even admit to that crazy suspicion that crossed my mind. However, I can tell you this. Some of the things she said made me think the person in question might actually be in my home, but that wasn't possible. I must have misunderstood her. What did you say to her? I asked. What can I say? She certainly saw what a terrible shock this was to me. Then the question arises, what is my responsibility in this matter? You see, she made me an accomplice in the aftermath. I think she saw it all quicker than I did. I was beyond shocked. She made me wait 24 hours, making me promise to do nothing during that time. She steadfastly refused to tell me the name of the scoundrel who blackmailed her. I think she was afraid that I would go to him immediately to settle the score, and in that case, she would be in big trouble. She told me. Within 24 hours I would hear from her. Oh my God. I swear to you, Shepherd, I never imagined what she was going to do. Suicide. And I pushed her to this point. No, no, I said. Don't have an exaggerated view of things. Her death was not your responsibility. The problem is. What should I do now? The poor lady has passed away. Why settle old scores? I couldn't agree more with you, I said. But there's one more thing. How could I catch the villain who drove her to death as if he had killed her with his own hands? He knew the first crime. And stared like some obscene vulture. She has paid the price. Can he get away with it? I understand, I said slowly. You want to hunt him down? It's going to get a lot of attention, you know. Yes, I have thought about this. I thought about it back and forth in my head. I agree with what you said. Villains should be punished, but the cost must be considered. Ackroyd stood up and walked back and forth. After a while, he sat back in his chair. Look here, Shepherd, let's just leave it like this. If there is no word from her, we let the dead rest in peace. You said. What does her message mean? I asked curiously. I have a strong impression that she must have left a message for me somewhere or in some way, before she left. I can't argue with that, but it is what it is. I shook my head. She didn't leave any letters or words. I asked. Shepherd, I believe she did. Also, I have a feeling that she deliberately chose death to bring all of this to light, if only to get revenge on the man who pushed her to the edge. I believe that if I could have met her then, she would have told me his name and told me to go out and find him. He looked at me. Don't you believe impressions? Oh, yes, in a sense I do. If, as you say, it should come from her. That I stopped. The door opened silently and Parker walked in, holding a tray with several letters on it. The Evening Post, sir, he said. Handed the tray to Ackroyd. Then he put away his coffee cup and backed out. My attention was distracted slightly and returned to Ackroyd. He stared at a long blue envelope like a man turned to stone. He had dropped the other letters. Her writing, he murmured. She must have gone out and mailed it last night, just before dash. He tore open the envelope and pulled out a thick attachment. Then he raised his head suddenly. Are you sure you closed the window? He said. I'm sure, I said in surprise. Why? Tonight I have been feeling the urge to be watched. The strange feeling of being watched. What's that dash? He turned sharply. So did I. We both thought we heard the slight click of the latch. I walked over and opened the door. No one was there. Nerves, Ackroyd said to himself. He unfolded the thick paper and read in a low voice. My very dear Roger, a life takes a life. I see it in your face this afternoon. So I took the only path open to me. I leave it to you to punish the person who made my life a living hell over the past year. I don't want to tell you the name this afternoon, but I'm going to write to you now. I have no children or close relatives to forgive, so don't worry about exposure. If you can, Roger, my very dear Roger, forgive me for the wrong I intended to do to you, because when the time came I was ultimately unable to do it. Ackroyd pressed his fingers on the paper to turn the page, then paused. Shepard, forgive me, but I must read this document alone, he said unsteadily. This was written for me and only I can read it. He put the letter into the envelope and put it on the table. Later, when I was alone. Don't want. I shouted impulsively, read it now. Ackroyd stared at me in surprise. Please forgive me, I said, blushing. I'm not asking you to read it out loud to me. I'm asking you to read it while I'm here. Ackroyd shook his head. No, I'd rather wait. But for some reason I don't understand myself, I continued to push him. At least, read the man's name, I said. Now Ackroyd is essentially a stubborn man. The more you push him to do something, the more determined he is not to do it. All my arguments are in vain. The letter arrived at 8:40. When I left him it was exactly 8:50 and the letter was still unread. I held the doorknob hesitantly, looking back to wonder if there was anything I hadn't done. I can't think of anything. Shaking my head, I walked out and closed the door behind me. I was surprised to see Parker's figure so close. He looked embarrassed and I thought he might be eavesdropping at the door. The man's face was fat, complacent and greasy, and there was obviously something cunning in his eyes. Mr. Ackroyd particularly didn't want to be disturbed, I said coldly. He asked me to tell you. Indeed, sir. I thought I heard a bell. It was such an obvious unreality that I didn't bother to respond. Parker guided me from the front to the hall, helped me put on my coat, and I walked out into the night. The moon was covered by clouds, and everything looked very dark and peaceful. The village church bell struck 9 as I passed the porter's door. I turned left towards the village and almost bumped into a man walking in the opposite direction. "Is this the way to Fernley Park, sir?" asked the stranger in a hoarse voice. That I looked at him. He is wearing a hat. The brim of the hat is pushed low, and the collar of the coat is turned up. I could barely see his face, but he seemed to be a young man. The sound is rough and uncultured. "This is the hotel door," I said. "Thank you, sir." He paused, then added redundantly, "You see, I'm a stranger here." He kept walking, and as he passed through the gate I turned to look at him. Oddly, his voice reminded me of someone I knew, but I couldn't remember who it was. 10 minutes later, I returned home again. Caroline was curious and wanted to know why I was back so early. I had to make up a slightly fictitious story about the evening to satisfy her, and I had an uneasy feeling that she saw through this transparent excuse. At 10 o'clock I got up, yawned, and suggested going to bed. Caroline agreed. It was Friday night. On Friday night I wind up. I did this as usual while Caroline made sure the servants locked the kitchen. When we went upstairs, it was already 10:15. As soon as I reached the top of the building, the phone rang below. "Mrs. Bates," Caroline said immediately. "I guess so," I said regretfully. I ran down the stairs and picked up the receiver. "What?" I said. "What?" "Of course, I'll come right away." I ran upstairs, grabbed my bag, and stuffed a few extra packets of dressing into it. "Parker's on the phone," I shouted to Caroline, "from Fernley. They've just discovered that Roger Ackroyd was murdered." Chapter 5. Murder. That I got out of the car and drove quickly to Fernley with little delay. I jumped out of the car and rang the doorbell impatiently. There was a delay in the response, so I pressed again. Then I heard the rattling of the chain, and Parker's face was expressionless, unmoved. Stand in the open doorway. That I squeezed past him and entered the hall. "Where is he?" I asked sharply. "What did you say, sir?" "Your master, Mr. Ackroyd." "Don't stand there staring at me, mate. Have you informed the police?" "Police, sir? You mean the police?" Parker stared at me. As if I were a ghost. "What's wrong with you, Parker? If what you say is true, your master was murdered. Parker let out a gasp. master? Murdered? Impossible, sir. It was my turn to stare. You didn't call me 5 minutes ago. Tell me, was Mr. Ackroyd found murdered? Me, sir? Oh. Absolutely not, sir. I couldn't even think about doing such a thing. You mean this is all a scam? Mr. Ackroyd doesn't have any questions? I'm sorry, sir, did the caller mention my name? I'll give you the exact words I heard. Is it Dr. Shepherd? I'm Parker, Fairley's butler. Please come here immediately, sir. Mr. Ackroyd was murdered. Parker and I looked at each other. What a bad joke, sir, he finally said in a shocked tone. I never expected to say such a thing. Where is Mr. Ackroyd? I asked suddenly. I think, sir, I'm still in the study. The ladies had gone to bed, and Major Blunt and Mr. Raymond were in the billiard room. I think I'll just go in and see him for a while, I said. I know he doesn't want to be disturbed anymore. But this strange prank left me uneasy. I just wanted to make sure he was okay. Indeed, sir. This makes me feel quite uneasy myself. If you don't mind me walking you to the door, sir? Not at all, I said. Come on. I walked in through the door on the right, followed closely by Parker. Passing through the small hall, where a short flight of stairs led to Ackroyd's bedroom, I knocked on the study door. No answer. I turned the handle, but the door was locked. Permit me, sir, said Parker. Such was his stature that he knelt nimbly with his eyes on the keyhole. The key is indeed in the lock. Sir, he said, standing up. Inside. Mr. Ackroyd must have locked himself in, and may have just fallen asleep. I bent down and confirmed Parker's statement. It seems okay, I said, but, Parker, I still have to wake up your master. I couldn't be content with going home without hearing from him that he was okay. As I said that, I shook the handle and shouted, Ackroyd, Ackroyd, wait a minute. But still no answer. I looked back. I don't want to alarm the people at home, I said hesitantly. Parker walked over and closed the door to the large hall from which we entered. I think that's all right now, sir. The billiard room is on the other side of the house, as is the kitchen and the ladies' bedroom. I nodded in understanding. Then I knocked again wildly, stooped down, and shouted through the keyhole. Ackroyd, Ackroyd. It's Shepherd. Let me in. Still silence. There was no sign of life in the locked room. Parker and I looked at each other. Listen, Parker, I said, I'm going to break this door down, or rather, we want to. I will take responsibility. If you say so, sir. Parker said doubtfully. I do say that. I am very concerned about Mr. Ackroyd, that I looked around the small foyer and picked up a heavy oak chair. Parker and I sandwiched it and attacked the lock. We threw it at the lock once, twice, 3 times. On the third impact, the lock snapped open and we stumbled into the room. Aykroyd sat in the armchair in front of the fire in which he had sat when I left. His head was tilted, and a shiny piece of twisted metal was clearly visible beneath the collar of his coat. Parker and I walked forward until we stood on the recumbent figure. I heard a sharp intake of breath from the butler. "Stabbed in the back," he whispered. "Horrible." He wiped his damp forehead with a handkerchief, then carefully reached out his hand to hold the handle of the dagger. "You can't touch that," I said sternly. "Go call the police immediately and tell them what happened. Then tell Mr. Raymond and Major Blunt." "Very good, sir." Parker hurried away, still wiping his sweaty forehead. I did what I had to do. I was careful not to disturb the position of the body, nor touched the dagger. Moving it won't give you any items. Aykroyd had apparently been dead for some time. Then I heard young Raymond's voice of horror and disbelief outside. "What do you say?" "Oh. Impossible. Where is the doctor?" He impulsively appeared at the door. Then he stopped, looking very pale. A hand pushed him aside and Hector Blunt walked past him into the room. "Oh my God!" Raymond said behind him, "That's true." Blunt walked all the way to the chair. He leaned over the body and I thought he was grabbing the handle of the dagger like Parker. I pulled him back with one hand. "Nothing can be moved," I explained. "The police have to see him for what he is now." Brent nodded with instant understanding. His face remained expressionless, but I felt as if there were signs of emotion hidden beneath that mask of indifference. Jeffrey Raymond now joined us, standing on Brent's shoulders, staring at the body. "This is too bad," he whispered. He had regained his composure, but as he took off his habitual pince-nez and wiped it, I noticed that his hands were shaking. "I think it was a robbery," he said. "How did that guy get in? Is it through the window? Has anything been taken?" He walked over to the table. "Do you think this is a burglary?" I said slowly, "What else could it be? There is no possibility that I want to commit suicide, right?" "No one would stab themselves in this way," I said confidently. "This is indeed murder." "But what's the motivation?" "Roger has no enemies in the world," Blunt whispered. "Must be a thief. But what does the thief want? Nothing seems to have been disturbed." He looked around. Raymond was still sorting the papers on his desk. "Nothing seems to be missing, and none of the drawers show signs of being tampered with," the secretary finally observed. "It's very mysterious." Brent moved his head slightly. "There are some letters on the ground," he said. That I lowered my head. 3 or 4 letters still lay where Aykroyd had dropped them earlier this evening. But the blue envelope containing Mrs. Ferrar's letter disappeared. I half opened my mouth to speak, but just then a bell rang through the house. There was a confused murmur in the hall, and then Parker appeared. Also with us were our local police chief and a police officer, Good evening, gentlemen, said the inspector. I'm so sorry about this. Such a kind gentleman as Mr. Ackroyd. The housekeeper said it was murder. No possibility of accident or suicide, doctor? Not any, I said. Ah. A bad business. He came over and stood above the body. Has it been moved? He asked sharply. I did not disturb the body in any way except to ensure that life was extinct, a simple matter. Ah. Everything indicates that the murderer has temporarily escaped. Now, tell me everything. Who discovered the body? I explained the situation carefully. You said there was a phone message. Is it the housekeeper calling? The message I never sent, Parker said seriously. I didn't go near the phone all night. Others can attest that I don't. That's strange, doctor. Does it sound like Parker's voice? I can't say I noticed. I take it for granted, you know. Certainly. Well, you come here, break in, and find poor Mr. Ackroyd like this. How long do you think he has been dead, doctor? At least half an hour, maybe more, I said. You said the door was locked from the inside? What about windows? I closed and locked it myself earlier in the evening at Mr. Ackroyd's request. The inspector strode over and opened the curtains. Well, it's open now anyway, he remarked. Indeed, the window was open, and the lower window was completely lift. The inspector took out a flashlight and illuminated the window sill outside. That's the way he went, he remarked, and came in. Look here. Under the strong flashlight light, several obvious footprints can be clearly seen. They appear to be left over from shoes with rubber spikes on the soles. One particularly clear footprint points inward, and another slightly overlapping footprint points outward. Simple as a long pole, said the inspector. Any valuables missing? Geoffrey Raymond shook his head. Not for us to find out. Mr. Ackroyd had never placed anything of particular value in this room. Well, said the inspector. Someone found an open window. Climbed in and saw Mr. Ackroyd sitting there. Maybe he was asleep. The man stabbed him from behind. Then he lost his courage and ran away. But the mark he left was clear. We should be able to find him easily. Are there no suspicious strangers hanging around? Oh. I said suddenly, what's wrong, doctor? I met someone tonight, just as I was walking out the door. He asked me the way to Fernley Park. When was that? Exactly 9 o'clock. I heard it chime as I turned out of the gate. Can you describe him? I did my best. The inspector turned to the housekeeper. Has anyone matching that description come to the front door? No, sir. No one has been to the house tonight. How's the back? I don't think so, sir, but I will make inquiries. He started towards the door, but the inspector raised a big hand. No, thank you. I'll ask myself. But first I want to establish the timing more clearly. When was Mr. Ackroyd last seen alive? It could have been me, I said, when I left at about 8:50. He told me that he did not wish to be disturbed, and I conveyed this order to Parker. Yes, sir, Parker said respectfully. Mr. Ackroyd must have been alive at 9:30, put in Raymond, for I heard him talking here. Who is he talking to? I have no idea. Of course, at the time I took it for granted that it was Dr. Shepard who was with him. I wanted to ask him a question about the file I was working on, but when I heard a voice, I remembered he said he wanted to talk to Dr. Shepard without being interrupted, so I left again. But now it seems that the doctor has left? I nodded. I was home at 9:15. I said. I didn't go out again until I got the call. Who could have been with him at 9:30? Asked the inspector. It's not you, sir, Major Blunt, I said. Major Hector Blunt? Asked the inspector, with a hint of respect in his tone. Blunt just nodded affirmatively. I think we've seen you here before, sir, said the inspector. I didn't recognize you at first, but you lived with Mr. Ackroyd in May last year. June, Brent corrected. Exactly, June. Now, as I said. Aren't you with Mr. Ackroyd at 9:30 tonight? Blunt shook his head. Never saw him again after supper, he volunteered. The inspector turned to Raymond again. You did not overhear anything going on, conversation, right, sir? I did hear a little part, said the secretary. Assuming I thought it was Dr. Shepard and Mr. Ackroyd together, that passage struck me as very strange. As far as I remember the exact words, Mr. Ackroyd was saying, my requests for my wallet have been so frequent lately that I'm afraid I won't be able to comply with your requests. Of course I left immediately, so I didn't hear anything more. But I'm a little surprised, because Dr. Shepard does not ask for a loan for himself, nor for subscriptions for others, I finished. A request for money, the inspector said thoughtfully. This could be a very important clue we find here. He turned to the butler. You say, Parker, no one is coming in through the front door tonight? That's what I said, sir. Then it is almost certain that Mr. Ackroyd himself must have let the stranger in. But I don't quite understand. The inspector fell into a kind of daydream, which lasted for several minutes. One thing is clear, he said at last, shaking off his reverie. A Mr. Ackroyd was alive at 9:30. This was the last moment he was confirmed alive. Parker coughed. With an apology, it immediately attracted the attention of the inspector. Okay, he said sharply. If you'll excuse me, sir, Miss Flora saw him after that. Miss Flora? Yes, sir. About 9:45. Then she told me that Mr. Ackroyd would not disturb me again tonight. Did he bring that news to you? That's not the case, sir. I was carrying a tray of sodas and whiskey when Miss Flora, who had just come out of the room, stopped me and said her uncle did not want to be disturbed. The inspector looked at the housekeeper more carefully than before. You have been informed that Mr. Ackroyd does not wish to be disturbed, have you not? Parker began to stutter. His hands were shaking. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Indeed, sir. Yet you propose to do this? I forgot, sir. At least that's what I mean. I always brought whiskey and soda at that time, sir, and asked if anything else was wanted, and I thought, well, I did it inadvertently. It was at this moment that I began to realize that Parker seemed unusually nervous. The man was trembling and looked uneasy. Well, said the inspector. I must see Miss Ackroyd at once. For now we're going to leave this room as it is. I can come back here after hearing what Miss Ackroyd has to tell me. I would just take the precaution of keeping the windows closed and locked. After completing this precautionary measure, he led the way into the hall, and we followed him. He paused, looked up at the small staircase, and then said to the police, Jones, you'd better stay here. Don't let anyone in that room, Parker interjected respectfully. If you'll forgive me, sir. If you lock the door to the main hall, no one can enter this section. That staircase led only to Mr. Ackroyd's bedroom and bathroom. There is no connection to the rest of the house. There had been a door leading there, but Mr. Ackroyd had sealed it. He likes to feel like his suite is completely private. To clarify things and explain the situation, I attach a rough sketch of the right wing of the house. As Parker explains, a small staircase leads to a large bedroom, created by merging two rooms, and an adjacent bathroom and restroom. The inspector saw the location at a glance. We entered the great hall and he locked the door behind him and put the key in his pocket. He then gave whispered instructions to the officer, who prepared to leave. We have to deal with those shoe prints as quickly as possible, the inspector explained. But first, I must speak to Miss Ackroyd. She was the last person to see her uncle alive. Does she know? Raymond shook his head. Well, there is no need to tell her the truth for the time being. Wait 5 minutes. She was better able to answer my questions without knowing the truth about her uncle. Tell her there has been a burglary and have her get dressed and come down to answer a few questions to see if she minds. It was Raymond who went upstairs to do the errand. Miss Ackroyd will be down in a minute, he said on his return. I told her what you suggested. Less than 5 minutes. Flora came down the stairs. She was wrapped in a pale pink silk kimono. She looked nervous and excited. The inspector took a step forward. Good evening, Miss Ackroyd, he said politely. We are concerned that there has been an attempted robbery and we are asking you to help us. What is this room? Billiard room? Please come in and sit down. Flora sat calmly on the wide sofa along the wall, looking up at the inspector. I don't quite understand. What was stolen? What do you want me to tell you? That's it, Miss Ackroyd. Parker says here that you came out of your uncle's study about 9:45. Is it right? That's right. I just went to say good night to him. Is the time right? Well, that was probably that time. I can't say exactly. Maybe later. Is your uncle alone, or is there someone accompanying him? He is alone. Dr. Shepherd has left. Did you notice whether the window was open or closed? Flora shook her head. I can't say. The curtains were drawn. That's right. Does your uncle look the same as usual? I think so too. Would you mind telling us what happened between you two? Flora paused for a minute, as if gathering her memories. I went in and said, "Good night, Uncle, I'm going to bed now. I'm very tired tonight." He made a sort of grunting sound, and then, I went over and kissed him. He said the dress I was wearing looked good, and then he asked me to hurry up because he was busy. So I left. Did he specifically ask not to be disturbed? Oh. Yes, I forgot. He said, "Tell Parker I don't want anything tonight and tell him not to bother me." I met Parker at the door. Tell him the information about his uncle. That's it, said the inspector. Can you tell me what was stolen? We're not so sure, the inspector said hesitantly. There was a look of horror in the girl's eyes. She stood up suddenly. What is this? Are you hiding something from me? Hector Blunt stepped between her and the inspector in his usual unobtrusive way. She half-stretched her hand, and he took it with both hands, patting it as he would a very small child. She turned to him as if his rock-hard demeanor promised comfort and safety. This is bad news, Flora, he whispered. Bad news for all of us. Your Uncle Roger, really? This will be a shock to you. Absolutely. Poor Roger is dead. Flora stepped away from him, her eyes widening with fear. When? She asked in a low voice. When? I'm worried that it wasn't long after you left him, Brent said seriously. Flora raised her hands to cover her throat and screamed softly. I hurriedly helped her, and she fainted. She fainted, and Blunt and I carried her upstairs and put her on the bed. Then I told him to call Mrs. Ackroyd. Tell her the news. Flora recovered quickly, and I took her mother to her and told her how to take care of her daughter. Then I hurried downstairs again. Chapter 6. Tunisian Dagger. That I met the inspector who had just come out of the door leading to the kitchen. How is the young lady doing, doctor? Recovering well. Her mother is by her side. Very good. I kept asking the servants. They all claimed that no one had been to the back door tonight. Your description of the stranger is somewhat vague. Can you give us some more specific information? I'm afraid I can't, I said regretfully. Recovering well. Her mother is by her side. Very good. I kept asking the servants. They all claimed that no one had been to the back door tonight. Your description of the stranger is somewhat vague. Can you give us some more specific information? I'm afraid I can't, I said regretfully. Look. It was a dark night, and the man pulled the collar of his coat high and his hat low, covering his eyes. Well, said the inspector. It looks like he's trying to cover his face. Are you sure it's not someone you know? I denied it, but not as firmly as I might have. I remember that the impression of that stranger's voice was not unfamiliar to me. I stuttered a bit while explaining to the inspector. You said it was a rough, uneducated voice? That I agree, but I think the roughness is almost exaggerated. If it is as the inspector thinks. The person who wants to hide his face can also try to disguise his voice. Doctor, would you mind coming into the study with me again? I have one or two things I want to ask you, that I acquiesced. Detective Davis opened the lobby door, we walked in, and he locked the door. We don't want to be disturbed. He said seriously. We don't want anyone eavesdropping either. What is this all about blackmail? Blackmail. I exclaimed in surprise. Is this an effort of Parker's imagination? Or is there something in it? If Parker hears anything about blackmail, I said slowly. He must have listened with his ear outside this door. Davis nodded. Nothing is more likely than this. You see, I've been investigating what Parker is doing tonight. To be honest, I don't like his attitude. This man knows something. When I started asking him, he became nervous. Made up some random story about blackmail. I made an instant decision. I'm glad you brought it up, I said. I've been debating whether to confess everything. I've pretty much decided to tell you everything, but I'm going to wait for the right time. You can find out now. I then recounted the events of the entire evening at that moment, as I have written here. The inspector listened attentively, occasionally interjecting a question. The most extraordinary thing I have ever heard, story, he said, when I had finished. You said the letter completely disappeared? This looks bad, very bad indeed. It gives us what we've been looking for, a motive for the murder. I nodded. I realized this. You say Mr. Ackroyd hinted that he suspected a member of his family was involved? The word family is such a broad term. Don't you think Parker himself might be the person we're looking for? I suggested. This looks similar. He was obviously leaning against the door listening as you came out. Then Miss Ackroyd later met him as he was about to enter the study. Suffice to say he tried again after she was safely away. He stabbed Ackroyd, locked the inner door, opened the window, went out that way, and went around to the side door he had left open. How about it? There's only one thing against that, I said slowly. If Ackroyd had continued reading that letter immediately after I left, as he intended to do, I don't think he would have continued to sit here thinking about it for another hour. He would immediately call Parker in, accuse him right then and then there would be a big commotion. Remember. Ackroyd was a bad-tempered man. Perhaps there was no time to write any further, the inspector suggested. We know that someone was with him at 9:30. If that visitor appears immediately after you have left, and after he has left Miss Ackroyd comes in to say good night, then he could not continue writing until nearly 10 o'clock. Where's the phone? Parker did utter that one, perhaps before he thought of the locked door and open window. Then he changed his mind, or panicked, and decided to deny knowing anything about it. That's it, trust me. Yes, I said with some skepticism. Anyway, we can find out the truth about the call from the telephone exchange. If it comes from here, I don't think anyone else but Parker could have made the call. Believe me, he is our target. But keep it secret, we don't want to alert him yet. Until we collect all the evidence. I'll make sure he doesn't get away. On the surface, we'll focus on your mysterious stranger. He stood up from his seat on the desk chair and walked over to the still figure in the armchair. This weapon should give us a clue. He looked up and said, "It's a pretty unique thing, I guess, from the looks of it, it's a curio." He bent down, examining the handle intently, and I heard him let out a grunt of satisfaction. Then, very carefully, he placed his hand under the hilt and pulled the blade from the wound. Holding the knife still so as not to touch the handle, he placed it in a wide china cup that adorned the mantelpiece. "Yes," he said, nodding towards it. "What a work of art. There shouldn't be many like this. This is truly a beautiful object. A narrow, tapering blade. And a handle made of intricately interwoven metals, with unique and meticulous craftsmanship." He carefully touched the blade with his fingers to test its sharpness, showing an expression of appreciation. "Lord, it's so sharp," he exclaimed. "A child could slice it through a man as easily as butter." "What a dangerous toy. Can I take a good look at the body now?" I asked. He nodded. "Continue." "I did a thorough inspection. How is it?" The inspector asked after I finished speaking. "I won't use technical terms," I said. "Save these for the investigation." The blow was delivered by a man standing behind him with his right hand, and death must have been instantaneous. From the expression on the dead man's face I may say that the blow was entirely unexpected. He may have died without knowing who his attacker was. "The housekeeper can move around as softly as a cat," Detective Inspector Davis said. "There won't be much mystery about this crime. Look at the hilt of that dagger." I took a look. "I dare say they are not obvious to you, but I can see them clearly." He lowered his voice. "Fingerprints." He stood a few steps away to judge his effect. "Yes," I said gently. "I guessed it. I don't understand why people think I have no intelligence at all. After all, I read detective novels and newspapers, and I'm just a guy of fairly average ability." If the dagger handle had footprints on it, that would be a different story entirely. I would be so surprised and in awe then. Did I think the inspector was annoyed that I refused to get excited? He picked up the porcelain cup and invited me to accompany him to the billiard room. I wanted to see if Mr. Raymond could tell us anything about the dagger, he explained. After we locked the exterior door again, we headed toward the billiard room, where we found Geoffrey Raymond. The inspector held up his evidence. Mr. Raymond, have you seen this? Why, I am almost certain that it was an antique given to Mr. Ackroyd by Major Blunt. It comes from Morocco, no, Tunisia. So was the crime committed using that? What a strange thing. It seems almost impossible, but it is almost impossible to have two identical daggers. Can I call Major Blunt? He hurried away without waiting for an answer. That young guy is nice, the inspector said. He has an air of honesty and innocence about him. I agree. During the 2 years that Geoffrey Raymond was Ackroyd's secretary, I have never seen him irritated or lose his temper. And I know that he was a very efficient secretary. After a minute or two, Raymond came back, with Blunt at his side. I was right, Raymond said excitedly. It's a Tunisian dagger. Major Blunt hasn't seen this, objected the inspector. I saw it as soon as I entered the study, the quiet man said. Did you recognize it then? Brown nodded. You didn't say anything about it, the inspector said doubtfully. Wrong moment, said Brent. Blurting out the words at the wrong time can do a lot of harm. He looked back at the inspector calmly. He gave a final snort and turned away. He handed the dagger to Blunt. You're pretty sure about this, sir? Can you identify it with certainty? Absolutely. Without a doubt. Where is this, curio usually kept? Can you tell me, sir? The secretary answered. On the silver table in the living room. What? I exclaimed. Others looked at me. Yes, doctor, the inspector said encouragingly. Nothing. Yes, doctor, the inspector said again, more encouragingly. That's so trivial, I explained apologetically. Only last night when I arrived for dinner I heard the lid of the silver table in the living room close. I saw deep suspicion and a hint of suspicion on the inspector's face. How did you know it was a silver table cover? I was forced to explain in detail, a long and tedious explanation. I'd rather not have to explain this. The inspector heard me out. Was the dagger in place when you looked at the contents? He asked. I don't know, I said. I can't say I remember noticing it, but of course, it might have always been there. We'd better get the steward, said the inspector, and rang the bell. A few minutes later. Miss Russell, summoned by Parker, entered the room. I don't think I've been anywhere near the silver table, she said when the inspector asked questions. I was checking to see if all the flowers were fresh. Oh. Yes, I remember now. The silver table was open. That's not how it should be. I closed the lid as I passed. She looked at him defiantly. "I see," said the inspector. "Can you tell me whether the dagger was in its place at the time?" Miss Russell looked calmly at the weapon. "I can't say, I'm sure," she answered. "I didn't stop to look. I knew my family would be coming down at any moment and I wanted to leave." "Thank you," said the inspector. There was only a trace of hesitation in his manner, as if he wished to question her further, but Miss Russell evidently took this remark as a dismissal, and left the room lightly. "I think she looks like a Tatar, huh?" said the inspector, watching her go. "Let me see. I thought you said the silver table was in front of a window, right, Doctor?" Raymond answered for me. "Yes, the window on the left." "Is the window open?" "They are all slightly open." "Well, I don't think we need to go any further into this. Someone, I'll just say someone." The dagger could be obtained at any time, it didn't matter when he got it. "I'll be over tomorrow with the sheriff, Mr. Raymond. Until then, I'll keep the key to that door. I wish Colonel Melrose could see everything as it is now. I happen to know that he is having dinner on the other side of the county, and, I believe, he will stay the night." We watched the inspector pick up the jar. "I'll have to be careful packing this," he observed said. "This will be an important piece of evidence and will be of great significance." A few minutes later, when Raymond and I came out of the billiard room, he chuckled softly, looking amused. That I felt the pressure of his hand on my arm and followed his gaze. Inspector Davis appears to be inviting Parker to comment on a small pocket diary. "Kind of obvious," my companion murmured. "So Parker is a suspect, huh? Are we also going to give Detective Davis a set of our fingerprints?" He took 2 cards from the card holder, wiped them with a silk handkerchief, then handed one to me and took the other for himself. Then, smiling, he handed them to the policeman for inspection member. "Souvenirs," he said. "First, Dr. Shepard, second, me, a humble man. One from Major Blunt will be coming tomorrow. Youth is very dynamic. Not even the brutal murder of his friend and employer could dampen Jeffrey Raymond's spirit for long. Maybe that's how it should be. I have no idea. I have long since lost this resilience. It was quite late when I got back and I hoped Caroline had gone to bed. I should have known better. She prepared hot cocoa for me and I drank it. She extracted the entire history of the evening from me. I made no mention of the blackmail, contenting myself with telling her the fact of the murder. "The police suspect Parker," I said, standing up to get into bed. "There seems to be a pretty clear case against him." "Parker," my sister said. "Nonsense. That inspector must be a complete fool." "Parker? Don't tell me." We went to bed with this vague statement. Chapter 7. I knew my neighbor's occupation. The next morning, I hurriedly finished my shift. My excuse was that I didn't have a very serious case to deal with. On my return, Caroline came into the hall to greet me. Flora Ackroyd is here, she announced in an excited whisper. What? I tried my best to hide my surprise. She wants to see you very much. She's been here for half an hour. Caroline led me into our small living room, and I followed. Flora sat on the sofa by the window. She was wearing black clothes and twisting her hands nervously. I was shocked when I saw her face. All color had drained from her face. But when she spoke, her demeanor was as calm and firm as possible. Dr. Shepherd, I'm here to ask you to help me. Of course he will help you, my dear, said Caroline. That I don't think Flora really wanted Caroline to show up for the interview. I believe she would have preferred to speak to me privately. But she didn't want to waste time either. So she made the most of the opportunity. I want you to come with me to Latches. Larch? I asked in surprise. To see that funny little man? Caroline exclaimed. Yes. You know who he is, right? We thought, I said, that he might be a retired barber. Flora's blue eyes opened wide. He's Hercule Poirot. You know who I mean, the private detective. They say he did the most amazing things, just like the detective in the book. He retired a year ago, moved here. Uncle knew who he was, but he promised not to tell anyone. Because Mr. Poirot wants to live quietly and does not want to be disturbed. So that's what he is, I said slowly. Of course you've heard of him? I'm a bit of an old-timer, as Caroline told me, I said, but I've just heard of him. Extraordinary. Caroline commented. I don't know what she meant. Maybe she failed to discover the truth herself. Do you want to go see him? I asked slowly. Now why? Let him investigate the murder, of course, said Caroline sharply. Don't be so stupid, James. I'm not being stupid. Caroline didn't always understand what I was trying to say. Don't you have confidence in Inspector Davis? I continued to ask. Of course not, said Caroline. Me neither. Anyone would have thought it was Caroline's uncle who was murdered. How did you know he would take the case? I asked. Remember, he has retired from active work. That's it. Flora said simply. I have to convince him. Are you sure you are making a wise decision? I asked seriously. Of course, said Caroline. If she is willing, I will go with her myself. If you don't mind, Miss Shepherd, I wish the doctor would come with me, said Flora. She knows the importance of speaking directly in certain situations. For Caroline, any hint would be in vain. You see, she explained, directly and appropriately, Dr. Shepherd, as the doctor, discovered the body and he was able to provide all the details to M. Poirot. Yes, said Caroline reluctantly. I see. I walked around the room several times. Flora, I said seriously, listen to me. I suggest you don't involve the detective. Flora jumped up, and a blush immediately appeared on her face. I know why you said that, she cried. But it is precisely because of this reason. That's why I wanted to leave so badly. You are afraid. But I'm not afraid. I know Ralph better than you do. Ralph, said Caroline. What does Ralph have to do with this? None of us listened to her. Ralph may be weak, Flora continued. He may have done stupid things in the past. Even evil things, but he won't kill. No, no, I exclaimed. I've never thought of him that way. Then why did you go to the Three Pigs bar last night? Asked Flora, on your way home, after your uncle's body was found? I was speechless for a moment. I had hoped that my visit would go unnoticed. How do you know? I shot back. I went there this morning, said Flora. I heard from the servants that Ralph lived there. That I interrupted her. Don't you know he's in the King's Abbot? No. I'm shocked. I cannot understand. I went there and asked them about him. They told me, and I think they told you last night, that he went out last night about 9 o'clock, and never came back. Her eyes met mine provocatively, as if in response to some emotion in my eyes. She suddenly said, Dash. So why can't he? He could have been anywhere. He may even have returned to London. Leave your luggage behind? I asked softly. Flora stamped her foot. I don't care. There must be a simple explanation. So you want to go find Hercule Poirot? Wouldn't it be better to just leave things as they are? The police didn't suspect Ralph at all, remember. They are investigating in another direction. But that's the truth, the girl shouted. They doubted him. A man from Cranchester turned up this morning, Inspector Raglan, a terrible, cunning little man. I discovered that he had been to the Three Pigs before me this morning. They told me what happened to him there and the questions he asked. He must have thought Ralph did it. If that's the case, that's a change from last night's thoughts, I said slowly. Did he not believe Davis's theory and thought it was Parker? Parker does, my sister said, snorting. Flora came forward and put her hand on my arm. Oh. Dr. Shepherd, we'll go find Mr. Poirot immediately. He will find out the truth. Dear Flora, I said softly. Putting his hand on hers. Are you really sure what we want is the truth? She looked at me seriously and nodded. You're not sure, she said. I'm sure. I know Ralph better than you do. Of course he didn't, said Caroline, who had been struggling to remain silent. Ralph may be a little extravagant. But he is a lovely boy and has good manners. I wanted to tell Caroline that many murderers have good manners, but Flora's presence made me scruple. As the girl was determined, I had to give in to her, and we set off at once. And left before my sister could utter her favorite opening line, of course. An old woman wearing a huge Breton hat opened the door to Larchy for us. It seems that M. Poirot is at home. We were introduced into a small living room that was very formally furnished. After a minute or so, my friend from yesterday came to meet us. "Mr. Doctor," he said with a smile. "Mississippi." He bowed to Flora. "Perhaps," I began, "you heard about the tragedy that happened last night." His face turned serious. "But I did hear about it. It's horrible." I express all my sympathy to the lady. "How can I serve you?" "Miss Ackroyd," I said, "want you to find the murderer," said Flora clearly. "I see," said the little man. "But the police do that, don't they?" "They may make mistakes," said Flora. "I think they're about to make a mistake now. Please, M. Poirot, can you help us? If it is a question of money." Poirot raised his hand. "Not that, I beg you, mademoiselle. It's not that I don't care about money." A glimmer of light flashed in his eyes. "Money means a lot to me. Always. No, if I get involved, you have to know one thing. I will stay the course. Good dog, he doesn't leave a cent, remember. You might wish you'd left it to the local police to handle after all." "I want the truth," Flora said, looking him straight in the eyes. "The whole truth?" "All the truth." "Then I accept it," the little man said quietly. "I hope you won't regret these words. Now, tell me all about it." "Dr. Shepherd had better tell you," said Flora. "He knows more than I do." So I began a careful narrative. Contains all the facts I have previously recorded. Poirot listened carefully, interjecting a question now and then, but for the most part he sat in silence, staring at the ceiling. Did I end my story the night before as I left Fernley Park with the inspector? "Now," said Flora, when I had finished, "tell him all about Ralph." I hesitated, but her majestic gaze pushed me forward. "Did you go to this hotel on your way home last night, this three-headed pig?" asked Poirot, when I had finished my story. "Why, then?" I paused. Choose my words carefully. I thought someone should tell the young man that his uncle was dead. After I left Fernley it occurred to me that Mr. Ackroyd and I were probably the only people who knew he lived in the village. Poirot nodded. "That's right. That's your only motive for going there, right?" "That was my only motive," I said stiffly. "Isn't it to, shall we say, make you feel at ease with this young man? Comfort yourself? I think, Mr. Doctor, you know exactly what I mean, even though you pretend not to. I suggest that if you find out Captain Patton is home all evening, that will be a relief to you." "Not at all," I said sharply. The little detective shook his head at me seriously. "You don't trust me as much as Miss Flora," he said. "But it doesn't matter. What we're looking at is this: Captain Patton is missing, and the situation demands an explanation. I won't hide it from you. This thing looks serious. It might have a completely simple explanation, though." "I have been saying this," cried Flora eagerly. Poirot did not mention the subject again. On the contrary, he suggested that he go to the local police station immediately. He thought that letting Flora, it's better to go home. I was supposed to accompany him there and introduce him to the police officer in charge of the case. We implemented the plan immediately. We find Inspector Davis outside the police station, looking very depressed. With him was Colonel Melrose, the chief of police, and another man. From Flora's description of cunning, I had no trouble identifying Inspector Raglan from Cranchester. That I knew Melrose quite well, and I introduced Poirot to him and explained the situation. The chief sergeant was visibly annoyed, and Inspector Raglan looked as sullen as Ray. Davis, however, seemed a little excited about his boss's displeasure. "This case will be simple and clear," Raglan said. "There's no need for an amateur to step in. You'd think any fool could see what happened last night, and we wouldn't have wasted 12 hours. He cast a vengeful glance at poor Davis, who received it with perfect indifference. "Mr. Ackroyd's family can certainly do what they see fit," Colonel Melrose said. "But we cannot allow the official investigation to be hindered in any way. I am of course aware of M. Poirot's great reputation," he added politely. "It's too bad that the police can't promote themselves," said Raglan. "It was Poirot who saved the day." I have literally retired from the world," he said. "I never intended to take on any more cases. Most of all, I was terrified of public attention. I must plead, if I can do anything to contribute to solving this mystery, please don't mention my name." Inspector Raglan's face brightened a little. "I've heard of some of your very remarkable successes," the colonel said, softening. "I have a lot of experience," said Poirot calmly. "But most of my success has been with the help of the police. I have great admiration for your British police. I would be honored and flattered if Inspector Raglan allowed me to assist him." The inspector's face became kinder. "Colonel Melrose took me aside. This little guy has done some pretty amazing things, I hear," he murmured. "Naturally we don't want to invite the Scotch Yard. Raglan seems confident in himself, but I'm not sure I agree with him. You see, know the people involved better than he does. This guy doesn't seem to be here for the fame, does he? Will cooperate with us silently, right?" "For the greater honor of Inspector Raglan," I said solemnly. Well, said Colonel Melrose, in a louder voice easily, "we must let you are informed of the latest developments, M. Poirot." "Thank you," said Poirot. "My friend, Dr. Shepherd, mentioned something about the housekeeper being suspected?" "That's total bullshit," Raglan said immediately. "These upscale servants can get so nervous over the smallest of things that they act suspiciously." "Fingerprints?" I hinted. "Nothing like Parker." He smiled slightly and continued. "And yours and Mr. Raymond's don't fit, Doctor. What about Captain Ralph Patton's guys?" Poirot asked quietly. I felt a secret admiration for the way he bravely faced difficulties. I saw a trace of respect in the inspector's eyes. I see you don't let the grass grow under your feet, M. Poirot. I believe it will be a pleasure to work with you. We will take the young gentleman's fingerprints as soon as we can get our hands on him. I can't help but think you're wrong, prosecutor, Colonel Melrose said enthusiastically. I've known Ralph Patton since I was a kid. He would never stoop to murder. Perhaps not, said the inspector ruthlessly. What do you think of him? I asked. I just went out at 9 o'clock last night. He was seen near Fernley Park at about 9:30. It has not been seen since. It is believed that he is facing severe financial difficulties. I have a pair of his shoes here. They have rubber spikes on the soles. He has 2 pairs of shoes that are almost identical. I'm going to go up now and compare them with those footprints. The police were there to make sure no one interfered with them. We'll go right away, said Colonel Melrose. You and M. Poirot will accompany us, won't you? We agreed and everyone got into the colonel's car. The inspector, anxious to see the footprints immediately, requested to be dropped off at the cabin. About halfway down the road to the cabin, a path branches off to the right. Windows opening to the terrace and Ackroyd's study. Would you like to go with Inspector Poirot, M. Poirot? Asked the chief inspector. Or would you rather inspect the study? Poirot chose the latter. Parker opened the door for us. His attitude was both complacent and respectful. He seemed to have recovered from the panic the night before. Colonel Melrose took a key from his pocket, opened the door to the hall, and led us into the study. Except that the body has been removed, M. Poirot, this room is exactly as it was last night. The body was found, where? I have described Ackroyd's location as accurately as possible. The armchair still stood in front of the fire. Poirot went over and sat down. That blue letter you were talking about, where was it when you left the room? Mr. Ackroyd put it on the little table to his right. Poirot nodded. Except for that, everything else is in its place? Yeah, I think so too. Colonel Melrose, could you be kind enough to sit in this chair for a moment? Thank you. Now, Mr. Doctor, could you tell me the exact location of the dagger? I did so. And the little man stood at the door. At that point, the hilt of the dagger was clearly visible through the doorway. Could both you and Parker see it immediately? Yes. Poirot then went to the window. Of course, the lights were on when you found the body, right? He asked over his shoulder. That I agreed. Joined him where he was studying the marks on the windowsill. The rubber studs have the same pattern as those on Captain Patton's shoes, he said softly. Then he returned to the center of the room again. His eyes looked around, searching every object in the room with quick, practiced eyes. Are you an observant person, Dr. Shepherd? He asked at last. I think so, I said, surprised. I see, there's a fire in the grate. What was the fire like when you broke down the door and found Mr. Ackroyd dead? Is it a small fire? I let out an annoyed laugh. I really can't say. I didn't notice. Maybe Mr. Raymond or Major Blunt. The little man opposite smiled slightly and shook his head. One must always proceed in an orderly manner. I made an error in judgment in asking you that question. Everyone has their own knowledge. You can tell me the details of a patient's appearance. Nothing there escapes your eye. If I wanted to know about the papers on that table, Mr. Raymond would have noticed anything that could be seen. To understand what happened to the fire, I had to ask the person who was responsible for observing these things. Do you allow? He walked quickly to the fire and rang the bell. A minute or two later Parker appeared. The bell has rung, sir, he said hesitantly. Come in, Parker, said Colonel Melrose. This gentleman wants to ask you something. Parker showed respectful attention to Poirot. Parker, said the little man. What was the state of the fire last night when you and Dr. Shepherd broke down the door and found your master dead? Parker answered without hesitation. It's a low fever, sir. Almost extinguished. Ah, said Poirot. The exclamation sounded almost triumphant. He went on, look around you. My dear Parker. Is this room exactly the same as it was then? The housekeeper's eyes glanced around, and finally stopped at the window. The curtains are closed, sir, and the lights are on. Poirot nodded in agreement. Are there any others? Yes, sir, the chair was pulled out a little too much. He pointed to a large grandfather chair by the window to the left of the door. I've attached a floor plan of the room with the chair positions marked with an X. Just show me, said Poirot. The butler pulled the chair 2 feet away from the wall and turned it so the seat faced the door. This is really strange, murmured Poirot. I don't think anyone would want to sit in this position. Now I wonder who pushed it back into place. Is it you, my friend? No, sir, said Parker. I'm too disturbed to see the master and all. Poirot looked at me. You, doctor? I shook my head when the police and I arrived. It's back in place, sir, Parker interjected. I'm sure of that.